Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Books Special Edition at the National Book Festival. Today I have Jean Luen Yang, who is the author of this book and this book and this book. Jean, welcome to...
Meg, thank you.
I'm so glad that you are here at the festival. You seem to be having a great time.
I've been having a great time. Yeah. I've been to this festival a few times and it's always amazing.
I know, it's a big book party. I love it.
It is. Yeah, it's like book prom.
So today you are on Let's Talk Books. And the first thing I ask every author who comes on this series is to book talk to me a book that you have loved and that you think other people should read. So what have you brought me?
I brought a book for you. It's called Samurai versus Ninja by Jason Shiga. How can you not love that title? Samurai versus Ninja. Jason Shiga, he and I are friends. But even if I did not like him as a person, I would still love his books. That's how good his books are. They're amazing. Jason was a math major in college, and then he went into cartooning. So he puts all of these math concepts into his stories. Samurai vs. Ninja is part of a series of his called Adventure Game Comics, and it is a choose your own path graphic novel. So it's sort of like a maze and a comic got together and had a baby. That's what this book is, you know? So the way it works is, as you're reading it, you read it like a normal graphic novel in the beginning. You go from panel to panel. And then at certain points, there are these tubes that branch into multiple directions. And at that point, you can decide which way to go. So ultimately, it's like Jason and I are about the same age. We grew up with these choose your own adventure books. This is like a comics version of that. So it's amazing because you as a reader really have power over how the story's going to go.
Okay, so two things I love about this. First thing is that he's a mathematician.
Yeah.
And you are a math fan also in a computer.
I do like math. I'm not as good at math as he is. He's much better than me.
But it's amazing because sometimes we separate kids who like math versus kids who like story, and we think of them as separate things when in fact brilliance can be in one thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can definitely love multiple things, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes, especially I think when we're in school, we get pigeonholed into one or two things that we like, but you can like all sorts of stuff.
I know it. So I hear you all the time start your introductions. You are so many wonderful things, but you always start with, I am a cartoonist. And so I want to ask you a little bit about that, like why you define first as a cartoonist, and when did you discover that you love comics?
Well, sometimes I've said I'm a graphic novelist, or I've said, I make comic books. I think I gravitate towards the term cartoonist because that's kind of what we call each other when we're talking amongst ourselves, Like I'm lucky enough to be friends with folks like Vera Brosgol and Raina Telgemeier and Tin Pham. And when we talk to each other about what we do, we call ourselves cartoonists. It sort of fits us into this weird little tradition that runs through American books.
Were you always a fan of comics, like as a young person?
I began collecting comics when I was in the 5th grade.
Oh,
and I think...
What was your favorite? What was the first thing you collected?
So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and in America at least, comics at the time were very limited in terms of genre. So almost all the comics that we were surrounded by were superhero comics. The very first comic in my collection was a Superman comic, but pretty quickly after that, Superman's a DC character. Pretty quickly after that, I became a Marvel fan. So I love Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, Silver Surfer, all of that stuff. Yeah. So that's kind of what I grew up reading.
Did you put things in plastic holders and
Yes, I did.
Yes, you're one of those.
I was one of those. I was definitely one of those.
Okay. So one thing I love about your graphic novels, and I've spent a lot of time sort of immersed in them. I have a confession to make. I don't first go to graphic novels, but boy, when I pick up your work, it's so easy to fall in love with it. Here are the things I especially love. I love that sometimes you are talking about history, for example, with Boxers and Saints. I love that you dive into a love story with a lunar love story, your most recent one. And with Dragon Hoops, like your life as a teacher and this memoir. And so I want to hear what you have to say about how you choose topics for your books. Like, is that how are there some things that you feel like don't work in graphic novel, or how do you pick the topics?
I think there are certain stories that work best in certain formats, and that's why I think sometimes when you're adapting a story from one format to another, the story itself has to change to take advantage of the strengths of the medium that you're adapting to. For graphic novels, I've always been attracted to this marriage of text and image. So for me, as a creator, I feel like I'm okay at drawing, I'm okay at writing, and then within this like hybrid format, like a graphic novel, I can use one to kind of hide the weaknesses of the other, and they have different ways of conveying information. I think emotion, for example, is conveyed very differently from when you're comparing how it's expressed in text versus how it's expressed in image. I think like with text, you can get these really subtle emotions.
Yeah.
And then with image, it's almost like, if you do it right, it's almost like you can bypass the reader's brain and put an image directly in their gut.
Yes.
And it's not going to be like the same subtlety. You can't get the same subtlety, but you can do that bypass.
Sure. You know what else you're really good at is being funny, which is your books make me laugh. You're funny in person. I don't know if your readers know this, you are. But you are also really funny on the page. And so what are your thoughts on that? What's the power of writing funny things for children? What's the plus?
Yeah, I think humor is it's such an important part of life, right? I think it's important because life can be so serious, and often for us to get through the serious stuff, we have to be able to laugh at ourselves a little bit.
For sure. So you start to say a little bit about your process, like in terms of writing them. So like when I read a graphic novel, I can read that's one of the things I love about it, that I could read this really big fat book fairly quickly and I feel so accomplished. When I finish, I'm like,
Yep.
Yay, Meg. So I think that's true for young people too. But I want to know, like, how long does it take you to create one of these gigantic? Yes, I want to know, because that must be hard to. And then they come at you and say, "I finished your book in 4 hours." So, tell me about that process. How long does it take?
I think I'm especially slow, but the books where I do both the writing and the drawing take forever. So American Born Chinese is about 200 pages. It took me 5 years to finish from beginning to end. Boxers and Saints together, I think it was like 500 pages maybe, and that took me 6 years to finish. And then Dragon Hoops took me like 5.5 years.
Woo!
They take forever, and that's in part because I'm a very slow artist. So for me, the books always start with ideas, and then eventually, when I've lived with the idea for a few weeks or a few months, sometimes a few years, I'll put it up as Post-it notes on a wall. I'll rearrange these Post-it notes. I'll add and delete Post-it notes. It'll sit in our bedroom. My wife has to stare at it all the time. And then when I feel pretty good about the arrangement of Post-it notes, I will translate that into an outline. And then from that outline, it depends on who I'm working with, right? If I'm working for Marvel and DC, I'll translate that into a comic script, which looks a little bit like a screenplay. If I'm working with First Second Books, which is my primary publisher, I'll translate that into thumbnail sketches, which are small sketches of what every page looks like.
Okay, I have a question for you. I want you to think back to yourself as a young boy or teen, and what's something that you think a young storyteller, young Jean, should focus on to develop their skills to be able to do the work that you do now as an adult?
I wish that when I was younger, I had learned to ignore the voice in my head that told me what I was doing was garbage. That's what I wish. I think this is pretty common, right, for people who are starting creative work. When I was young, I just had a hard time getting to the finish line with any of the comics that I was doing, no matter how long or how short. I would be very excited about an idea, and then I would get to work on it, and about halfway through or 3/4 of the way through, I'd get that voice saying, what I'm doing right now is terrible, I should stop. And then I would have this other idea in my head. I'd go, oh, that's a better idea. That's a shinier idea. And I'd move on to that. And I just had all this stuff that I'd never finished, all these like bits and pieces of story. And it took me a long time to figure out, if I could just push through that voice, if I could ignore that voice enough to get to the finish line. Once I finished, I could look back. It wouldn't be a perfect story, but it would be better than I thought it was.
You are just a delight. I'm so glad that you came, of course, this year, and that we got a chance to be together on stage and here at Let's Talk Books. And I hope that you and I are going to cross paths again and again and again.
Absolutely, we will. We're part of the same club now, Meg.
I'm in. Thanks.
Thank you. This has been great. It's always great to spend time with you, Meg. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean.